My dad's best friend showed up 3 days after the funeral and said, he asked me to give you this when he was gone. I took the envelope. It was heavy, heavier than a few sheets of paper should be. Dennis didn't stick around. He looked like he hadn't slept since the burial, his eyes bloodshot and the skin under them sagging like wet paper. He just patted my shoulder, muttered something about being a phone call away, and walked back to his truck. I watched him pull away, his tires crunching on the gravel of the driveway. My dad had resurfaced himself just last July. Another thing he did while he was dying. Another weekend spent sweating in the sun, refusing help, while his heart was a ticking clock. I went into the living room. My mother was in the kitchen, the rhythmic clink of a spoon against a ceramic mug, the only sound in the house. She'd been making tea she didn't drink for 3 days straight. I sat on the sofa, the one with the dip on the left side where he'd sat every night for 20 years, and I stared at my name on the envelope. The handwriting was steady, no tremors, no signs of a man who knew his body was failing him. I opened it. There were the 4 pages of the letter, but tucked behind them was a key, a small brass Yale key with a bit of blue electrical tape wrapped around the top. On the tape, he'd written a single number, 402. I read the letter first. I read it 3 times. The first time, I was just looking for an apology. The second time, I was looking for a reason. The third time, I was just looking for him. I'm not asking you to forgive me, he wrote. I'm asking you to understand that I was happy. It felt like a slap. He was happy because he'd successfully lied to us for 8 months. He'd tricked us into giving him a normal year by stealing our right to say goodbye. I felt the heat rising in my neck. I wanted to go out to the garage and smash that bookcase he was so proud of. I wanted to scream at the empty chair in the kitchen. I looked at the key. I knew what it was for. There's a self-storage facility about 10 miles out of town, off the old highway. We'd kept stuff there years ago when they were remodeling the house. I didn't tell my mother. She was already fragile, staring at the bookcase through the kitchen door like it was a ghost. I grabbed my jacket, told her I was going for a drive, and left. The storage facility was one of those depressing places with corrugated metal doors and gravel lots that never seemed to dry out. It smelled like wet dust and cold engines. I drove down the rows until I found Unit 402. The padlock was new. The key slid in perfectly. When I rolled the door up, the sound was deafening in the quiet afternoon. I expected to find old furniture, maybe some boxes of files he didn't want us to see. Instead, the unit was mostly empty, except for a workbench he'd set up in the center and a row of plastic bins stacked against the back wall. On the workbench was a ledger. I walked over and opened it. It wasn't a diary. It was a logbook. June 14th. Diagnosis confirmed. Dr. Aris says 6 to 12 months, starting the list today. The list followed. It wasn't a bucket list. There was no see the Grand Canyon or skydive. It was a list of every single thing in our lives that he usually handled. Things he knew we wouldn't know how to do once he was gone. July 2nd. Flush the water heater. Note for Mike. Show him where the pressure relief valve is. If I don't get to it, write it down. August 12th. Renewed the home insurance. Switched it to the auto pay from the joint account so Sarah doesn't have to worry about the mail. September 19th. Fixed the leak in the upstairs crawl space. It's a temporary patch. He'll need to call Miller's Plumbing in a year or two. The number is in the yellow folder. I went through the bins. They were organized by year, starting 10 years into the future. Bin 1, 2027. Bin 2, 2030. Bin 3, 2035. I opened the first one. Inside were envelopes. One for my mother's 65th birthday. One for what would have been their 40th anniversary. One for me marked, when you buy your first house. He had spent those 8 months, the months he told us he was fine, preparing for a future he knew he wouldn't see. He hadn't just been grilling burgers and watching football. He had been a man frantically building a life raft for the people he was leaving behind. I sat on a milk crate in that cold, dark storage unit, and I finally cried. Not the quiet, polite crying I'd done at the funeral. I sobbed until my ribs ached. He was a liar. He was a stubborn, prideful, secretive man who thought he knew best. He had robbed me of 8 months of honesty. But looking at those bins, I realized he had also given me the only thing he had left, his protection. I spent 4 hours in that unit. I went through the ledger. He'd listed the PIN codes for his accounts. He'd written down the specific brand of fertilizer he used for the lawn because my mom liked the way the grass looked in the spring. He'd even written a note about the neighbor, Mr. Henderson, reminding me to check on his gutters because the old man couldn't climb ladders anymore and Dad had been doing it for him for years. I realized then that the normal year he wanted wasn't for him. It was for us. He didn't want our last memories of him to be of a dying man in a bed. He wanted them to be of a man who finished the bookcase, a man who took his wife to the coast, a man who was strong until the very second he wasn't. I locked the unit and drove home. The sun was down by the time I pulled back into the driveway. The house was dark, except for the light over the stove. I walked inside and found my mother still in the kitchen. She had finally made a sandwich, but it was sitting untouched on a paper towel. I sat down across from her and put the key on the table. "What's that?" she asked. "It's the rest of the letter," I said. I told her everything. I told her about the storage unit, the bins, the ledger. I told her about the water heater and the insurance and the anniversary cards waiting for her in 2030. She listened without interrupting. Her hands stayed wrapped around her cold mug of tea. When I finished, she picked up the key and turned it over in her fingers. "He always hated being a bother," she whispered. "I know. He thought if we knew, we'd stop living. He thought we'd just start waiting." I looked at the kitchen door, through to the living room where the bookcase stood. It was made of solid oak. It was heavy, sturdy, and built to last 100 years. "He was wrong to hide it," I said. My voice was firm. "I still believe that. But he loved us, Mom, in the most difficult, complicated way possible." She stood up and walked over to the bookcase. She ran her hand along the top shelf. There was no dust. He'd polished it the day before he died. "I'm going to go see it tomorrow," she said. "The unit. I'll take you." "No," she said, looking back at me. A little bit of the old strength was back in her eyes. "I think I need to go by myself. I need to have a word with him about that water heater." I nodded. We stayed up late that night. We didn't talk about the heart attack or the hospital. We talked about the time he tried to fix the dishwasher and ended up flooding the basement. We talked about the way he used to sneeze 3 times every time he walked into direct sunlight. We talked about the man, not the patient. When I finally went went to bed, I didn't feel the anger anymore. It was still there, somewhere deep down, but it was being crowded out by something else. I realized he had achieved exactly what he wanted. He had gone out on his own terms. He had left us with a bookcase, a clean lawn, and a stack of letters to lead us through the next 20 years. He was a stubborn old man, but he was my father. The next morning, I woke up early. I went down to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. I looked out the window at the lawn. It was still dormant, brown and flat under the winter frost, but in a few months, it would need fertilizer. I knew exactly which brand to buy. I went to the storage unit with her anyway. She didn't fight me on it when the morning actually came. I think the silence of the house at 7 a.m. was louder than she expected, and the idea of facing his ghost in a cold metal box alone was suddenly too much. We drove in my truck. She sat in the passenger seat, clutching her purse in her lap with both hands. We didn't talk. We didn't even turn on the radio. The local station usually played classic rock that he would have hummed along to, and neither of us was ready for a stray Creedence Clearwater song to wreck our composure. When we got to Unit 402, I rolled up the door. The morning light hit the concrete floor, illuminating the dust motes dancing over his workbench. My mother walked inside like she was entering a cathedral. She didn't look at the bins first. She went straight to the workbench and touched his tools. They were laid out with surgical precision wrenches, screwdrivers, a soldering iron. He'd cleaned them, every single one. There wasn't a speck of grease on the handles. He knew he was leaving, she said. It wasn't a question. Yeah, she turned to the bins. I watched her face as she read the years written on the tape. When she got to times 2030, she stopped. Her fingers hovered over the plastic lid, but she didn't open it. He's still trying to manage things, she whispered. She sounded half angry, half heartbroken. Even now, he's trying to schedule my life for the next decade. That's Dad, I said. I moved to the back of the unit and found a smaller box I hadn't noticed the day before. It was tucked under the workbench, labeled simply Mike Garage. I pulled it out. Inside wasn't a letter or a schedule. It was his old 1970s era multimeter, a heavy-duty set of jumper cables, and a small leather-bound notebook. I opened the notebook. It wasn't a log of chores. It was a list of people. Joe at the hardware store. Good man, but he'll try to upsell you on the galvanized nails. Tell him you're my son, and he'll give you the contractor rate. The guy who mows the vacant lot next door. He's a bit of a talker, but he's got a good heart. If the fence ever blows down, call him first. He's handy with a welder. The mechanic on 4th Street. Don't take the truck anywhere else. He knows the transmission is finicky. I paid him through the end of the year for the next 3 oil changes for your mom's car. It's in the books. It went on for pages. It was a map of his world, the small, local network of favors and handshakes he'd built over 40 years. He wasn't just giving me tools. He was handing me his reputation. He was making sure that when I stepped into his shoes, I wouldn't trip. My mother finally opened the bin for the current year. She pulled out a thick blue folder. Inside were all the deeds, the titles to the cars, the life insurance policies, and a handwritten note explaining the hidden fuse box in the basement that only he could ever find. There was also a small jeweler's box. She opened it. Inside was a gold charm for her bracelet, a tiny lighthouse. We saw this in a window in Cannon Beach, she said, her voice cracking. Back in September, I told him it was pretty, but we didn't have time to stop. I thought he was looking for a parking spot. I didn't know. She sat down on the milk crate I'd used the night before. She held that tiny piece of gold like it was the most fragile thing in the world. He wasn't there with me, she said, looking up at me. On that trip, not entirely. He was already here, in this room, planning for the time he wouldn't be. He was trying to do both, Mom. It's lonely, she said, knowing he was carrying all this while I was complaining about the hotel pillows. I sat on the floor next to her. The cold of the concrete seeped through my jeans. He wanted you to complain about the pillows. That was the point. If you were complaining about pillows, it meant everything was normal. That's what he wanted, to give you a world where the biggest problem was a lumpy mattress. We stayed there for another hour. We started moving some of the immediate bins into the truck, the ones for 5, 10, 15 years in the future. We left. We decided they should stay there, in the quiet, until their time came. It felt like leaving a piece of him on guard duty. As we were locking up, I noticed a small piece of paper taped to the inside of the rolling door, right at eye level where he would have seen it every time he left the unit. It wasn't for us. It was a note to himself. Keep it together. Just a few more weeks. Make it count. I realized then that it hadn't been easy for him. The letters made it seem like he was some stoic mastermind, but that note, that was the reality. He'd been scared. He'd been tired. He'd been forcing himself to act normal while his heart was literally failing in his chest. I pulled the door down and locked it. On the drive back, the sun finally broke through the gray clouds. It wasn't warm, but it was bright. We stopped at a diner on the way home. It was the place he used to take us after church. We sat in a booth and ordered breakfast. The waitress, a woman who'd worked there since I was in diapers, came over with the coffee pot. "Where's the big guy today?" she asked, looking at the empty spot next to my mother. The silence that followed was heavy. I felt the familiar lump in my throat. My mother took a breath. She reached out and touched the lighthouse charm she'd pinned to her sweater. "He's busy," she said. Her voice didn't shake, but he left us some instructions. "We're just catching up." The waitress looked confused, but she nodded and poured the coffee. I looked at my mom. She looked older, sure. She looked tired, but she also looked like someone who had just been given a map in the middle of a forest. When we got home, I didn't go inside right away. I went into the garage. I walked over to the bookcase. I pushed on it, testing its weight. It didn't budge. It was solid. I went to his workbench in the back of the garage, the one he'd used before setting up the secret one in the storage unit. There was a single wood shaving left on the floor. I picked it up and held it for a second before letting the wind take it. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the basement, finding that hidden fuse box. It was behind a false panel in the laundry room. He was right. I never would have found it on my own. Taped to the inside of the panel was one last note. "In case the lights go out, don't panic. Just flip the red one." I didn't panic. I just leaned my forehead against the cool metal of the fuse box and breathed. He was gone. The house was quieter. The Sundays would be different, but the lights were still on. And as long as I had that ledger and those bins, I knew I could keep them on for a long, long time. I went upstairs. My mother was in the kitchen, finally drinking a cup of tea. She was reading the blue folder. "Mike?" she called out. "Yeah, Mom?" The water heater, she said, pointing toward the basement stairs. The note says it needs flushing. Do you think you can figure it out? I looked at the brass key on the counter, the blue electrical tape glinting in the afternoon sun. Yeah, I said. I can figure it out. He left me a diagram. I went to the garage, grabbed the tools he'd left for me, and got to work. It was a Tuesday, just another normal day, exactly the way he wanted it. The water heater was just the beginning. It's one thing to read a manual. It's another to be on your knees on a cold concrete floor, trying to wrench a plastic valve that hasn't been turned in 3 years. I spent 2 hours down there, swearing under my breath, getting soaked when the hose coupling leaked, and generally feeling like an idiot. But every time I felt like throwing the wrench, I'd look at the ledger. He'd written, "Don't force it, just give it a tap with the mallet. It's stubborn, like your mother's side of the family." I tapped it. It turned. That was the rhythm of the next 6 months. It wasn't some grand cinematic journey. It was a series of small, domestic battles. I spent my weekends at the house, fixing things I didn't know were broken and preparing for things that hadn't happened yet. By May, the lawn was the greenest on the block. I'd followed the fertilizer schedule to the day. Standing there with the spreader, I realized I was becoming a man who cared about nitrogen levels. I was 32, and I was turning into my father faster than I ever thought possible. My mother started going to the storage unit once a month. She called it consulting the oracle. She'd go on a Saturday morning, sit in the unit for an hour, and come back with a list. Sometimes it was stuff for me to do, but mostly it was just stuff for her to know. She found a list of all their passwords, a copy of their wedding video he digitized in secret, and a folder of recipes he liked. That was really just a list of the local takeout places that didn't use too much salt. In June, on the anniversary of the day he got his diagnosis, I went to the unit alone. I was looking for bin 2, the one marked times 2030. I knew he said to wait, but the curiosity was a physical weight in my chest. I wanted to know what he thought the world would look like in 5 years. I wanted to see if he'd predicted my life or if he was just guessing. I opened the lid. It wasn't as full as the others. There was a single large padded envelope at the top. On it, he'd written, "For the first big fight." I sat on the milk crate and opened it. Inside was a bottle of expensive scotch, the kind he'd only buy for weddings and 2 glasses. There was a note taped to the bottle. "If you're reading this, you've probably hit a wall. Maybe it's with your mom. Maybe it's with a girl. Maybe it's just with life. Usually, by the 5-year mark, the new wears off and the real sets in. Pour a drink. Sit down. Remember that nothing is as permanent as it feels right now. Except this scotch. This stuff is 20 years old. It can wait another hour while you calm down." I didn't pour a drink. I put it back. It felt like trespassing on a conversation I wasn't ready to have yet. I was heading back to the truck when I saw Dennis's truck pulling into the lot. He hopped out, looking a little better than he had in February. He had a fishing rod in the back of the bed. "Checking the inventory?" Dennis asked, leaning against the doorframe of the unit. "Something like that," I said. "Did you know about all this, Dennis? The bins, the letters?" Dennis looked at the stack of plastic tubs. He sighed, a long, tired sound. I helped him move the heavy stuff in. He didn't let me read anything. He just said he was building a library. I thought he meant books. He was always a weird son of a bitch about his privacy. He was a liar, I said, but there was no bite in it anymore. He was a man who knew his time was up and didn't want to leave a mess, Dennis countered. He spent his whole life cleaning up after people. Why would he stop at the end? Dennis reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. He gave me this too, told me to give it to you when the grass turned green. I took it. It was a map, not a hand-drawn one, but a printout of a topographical map of a lake about 3 hours north. There was an X marked in a small cove near the timberline. "What's this?" "The spot," Dennis said. "The one we never told anyone about. The one where the base are so big they'll snap a line just for looking at 'em wrong. He wanted you to go. Told me to tell you that the tackle box in the garage has a false bottom. The real lures are under the tray." I looked at the map. I hadn't gone fishing since I was 16. I'd told him it was boring. I'd told him I didn't see the point in sitting in a boat for 8 hours just to catch something I was going to throw back anyway. "You want to go?" I asked Dennis. "Nah," Dennis said, patting his rod. He was very specific. He said you needed to go alone the first time. Something about quiet reflection, which is a hell of a thing coming from a man who used to yell at the TV during every Giants game. I went that weekend. I found the tackle box. I found the false bottom. Inside were 3 lures, hand-carved from cedar. They were beautiful, smooth, painted with intricate scales, weighted perfectly. He'd made them himself, probably during those long nights in the garage when he told us he was just fiddling with the mower. I drove up to the lake. The cove was hard to find, hidden behind a curtain of weeping willows. I rented a small aluminum boat with an outboard motor that sounded like a lawnmower underwater. I reached the X. The water was like glass, reflecting the pines and the late afternoon sun. I sat there for 3 hours. I didn't catch a single thing. I didn't care. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel like I was following a set of instructions. I wasn't flushing a heater or fertilizing a lawn. I was just sitting in the quiet he'd picked out for me. I looked at the lures in the tray. I realized then that the letters and the bins weren't just about the house or the money. They were a distraction. He knew that if he gave us enough work to do, we wouldn't drown in the grief. He'd turned our mourning into a series of projects. He'd given us a way to keep busy until the sharp edges of his absence wore down. I packed up the gear as the sun started to dip below the trees. On the drive back, I stopped at a roadside stand and bought a flat of strawberries. My mom loved them, and I knew she'd be sitting on the porch waiting for me to tell her how the fishing was. When I pulled into the driveway, she was there, just like I thought. She had a book in her lap, but she wasn't reading it. "Any luck?" she asked. "Not a bite," I said, hopping out and handing her the strawberries. "I think the map is a prank. He'd probably just wanted me to spend $60 on gas." She laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that reached her eyes. "That sounds like him." We went inside and made dinner. We didn't talk about the ledger. We didn't talk about the bins. We just talked about the strawberries and the way the light hit the lake. Before I left to go back to my own apartment, I went into the garage one last time. I looked at the bookcase. I looked at the workbench. I realized I didn't need to check bin 2 yet, or bin 3. The instructions were there if I needed them, but the real gift wasn't the information. It was the fact that he'd trusted me to handle it. He'd spent his last months betting on the idea that I was strong strong enough to keep things running. I turned off the garage light. I didn't need to see the hidden fuse box to know where it was. I could find it in the dark now. I got in my truck and drove home. The road was clear. The moon was up. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. He was right. I was like him. And because I was like him, I knew exactly what to do next. I was going to wake up tomorrow. I was going to go to work. And I was going to live the life he'd worked so hard to protect. It wasn't a perfect ending. It was just a Tuesday in June, but it was normal. And that was plenty. The strawberries didn't last through the week, but the feeling of that afternoon on the lake stayed. It was like a layer of static had finally been cleared from the air. By August, the house felt different. The smell of old man, that mix of sawdust, peppermint, and motor oil was fading, replaced by the scent of the lemon wax my mom used on the floors and the neutral, clean air of a house that was being lived in, not just maintained. I was over on a Saturday, helping her clear out the junk drawer in the kitchen, the one every house has, filled with dead batteries, mystery keys, and rubber bands. We were tossing out old takeout menus from places that had closed 5 years ago when the phone rang. It was a lawyer, not his usual guy, Mr. Henderson, but someone from a firm downtown I'd never heard of. Mr. Thorne, I'm calling regarding a trust established by your father. There's a final disbursement scheduled for the 6-month mark. I'd like to invite you and your mother to the office on Monday. I looked at my mom. She'd heard. Her hand went to her throat. Another one? She whispered. Monday morning, we were sitting in a high-rise office that smelled like expensive leather and air conditioning. The lawyer, a man named Sterling, who looked like he'd never handled a wrench in his life, pushed a single, thin folder across the desk. Your father was very specific, Sterling said. This wasn't about the house or the savings accounts. This was a separate policy he started 30 years ago. He told me it was for the transition. I opened the folder. It wasn't a mountain of cash. It was a deed. He had bought a small one-story cottage 2 towns over, near the library and the park where my mom's sister lived. The date on the purchase was 3 months before he died. There was a final note clipped to the deed. Sarah, it started. I know you love the house. I know we built it together, but I also know those stairs are getting steeper every year, and the yard is too much for one person, even with Mike helping. I didn't want you to feel like you had to leave. I wanted you to feel like you were choosing to move towards something easier. If you want to sell the big house, this one is waiting. It's got a small garden, no stairs, and the water heater is brand new. I checked it myself. My mother didn't cry this time. She just traced the lines of the floor plan with her thumb. He was moving me out before he even left, she said. He was looking ahead, Mom, I said. He knew you'd stay in that big house until the roof fell in just because you felt like you had to stay for him. We went to see the cottage that afternoon. It was perfect. Small, bright, and manageable. In the backyard, there was a single young maple tree planted right in the center of the lawn. I walked over to it. Tied to the stake, supporting the trunk, was a small plastic tag. It wasn't a nursery label. It was a piece of masking tape with his handwriting, now slightly faded by the sun. Give it 10 years. It'll be big enough for a swing. That was the moment it clicked for me. The 4 pages, the storage unit, the ledger, the cottage. It wasn't just about him wanting to be in control. It was his way of apologizing for leaving early. He couldn't give us his presence, so he gave us his foresight. He turned himself into a ghost that didn't haunt but guided. We put the big house on the market in September. Moving was a nightmare, but in a good way. It forced us to go through every box, every closet, every memory. We found things we'd forgotten, my old finger paintings, her wedding veil, a collection of matchbooks from every restaurant they'd ever visited. We didn't take everything. We had a garage sale that felt like a neighborhood reunion. Dennis came over and bought my dad's old table saw. He looked at me, then at the saw, and then back at me. You sure you don't want this, kid? I've got the tools in the unit, Dennis, I said. Keep it. Use it. Dad would have wanted you to have it. Dennis nodded, rubbed a hand over the steel top of the saw, and loaded it into his truck. The day we finally locked the door of my childhood home for the last time, I stood in the empty living room. The sun was hitting the spot where the bookcase used to be. There was a rectangular patch on the floor where the wood was darker, protected from the sun for months. I thought about the man who stood there, knowing his heart was a ticking bomb, finishing a piece of furniture so his wife would have a place for her books. I felt a strange sense of completion. We moved my mom into the cottage. I spent the first night there on the sofa, just in case she got spooked. But the next morning, I found her in the kitchen, making coffee and looking out at the maple tree. I think I'm going to be okay, Mike, she said. I know you are. I went back to the storage unit one last time that week, not to take anything out, but to put something in. I'd bought a new ledger. I'd started it on the first page. October 12th, Mom moved in. The maple tree looks healthy. I checked the gutters on the cottage. They're clear. I think I'm going to ask Claire to marry me next month. I wish you were here to tell me if the ring is too flashy, but I think I know what you'd say. You'd say, don't be a cheapskate. She's worth more than the stone. I put the new ledger on the workbench, right next to his. I didn't open the 2030 bin. I didn't need to. I realized that the letters weren't a script I had to follow word for word. They were a safety net. And for the first time since that Tuesday in February, I felt like I could walk the wire without looking down. I rolled down the metal door of Unit 402 and locked it. The sound echoed through the gravel lot, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt like a period at the end of a long, honest sentence. I got into my truck, the one he'd made sure was serviced, and I drove toward the jewelry store. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't have to. I knew exactly where I was going, and I knew he'd already cleared the way. The proposal happened on a Friday in November. I didn't do anything flashy. No scoreboard at a game. No choreographed moment in a crowded restaurant. I took Claire to the coast, to the same rocky overlook my dad had taken my mom to every anniversary for 30 years. The wind was cold enough to make our eyes water, and the salt spray hung in the air like a fine mist. When I pulled out the ring, my hands were steady. I wasn't nervous. I felt like I was standing on solid ground he'd leveled for me months ago. She said yes before I even finished the sentence. We drove to the cottage that night to tell my mother. She was sitting in her new living room, the one with the large windows facing the maple tree. When she saw the ring, she didn't cry. She just smiled a deep, knowing smile and went to the mahogany sideboard he'd moved in for her. She pulled out a bottle of champagne, not the scotch from the storage unit, but a bottle I'd never seen before. Taped to the neck was a small, circular piece of white paper. For the the engagement. Don't wait for the wedding to celebrate the small wins. He bought this 2 weeks before the heart attack, she said, popping the cork. He told me it was for a rainy day. I think he knew the weather was changing. We sat in that small, warm house and talked about the wedding. For the first time, it didn't feel like we were talking around a hole in the room. We were just a family, moving forward. The wedding was set for June. As the months ticked by, the storage unit became less of a shrine and more of a library. I'd go there when I was stressed about the guest list or the cost of the catering. I'd sit on the milk crate, breathe in the smell of his tools, and read a page of the ledger. He didn't have advice on flowers or music, but he had notes on how to keep your cool when things got chaotic. If the car won't start on the way to the church, call Dennis. He's already got the jumper cables in his trunk. I told him to keep them there for the whole month of June. I didn't call Dennis. The car started fine. The morning of the wedding, I went to the unit one last time as a single man. I stood in front of bin 2x2030. I still hadn't opened it. I looked at the tape, the edges starting to peel slightly. I reached out, touched the plastic lid, and then pulled my hand back. I realized I didn't want to know the future yet. He'd given me the foundation, the tools, and the house. He'd given me the normal year and the transition, but the rest of it, the years that were actually mine, those belonged to me and Claire. I left the bin sealed. At the reception, there was an empty chair at the head table. No photo, no big memorial display, just a glass of his favorite cheap beer and a small card that said, reserved. Dennis stood up to give the toast. He looked at me, then at Claire, and then he looked at that empty chair. He cleared his throat, his voice gruff. Your old man was a pain in the neck, Dennis said, and a few people laughed. He was quiet, he was stubborn, and he thought he was the only one who knew how to use a level properly. But he loved this family with a ferocity that most people don't even have the breath for. Dennis raised his glass. He told me once that a man's job isn't to be a hero, it's to be a floor, something solid for the people he loves to walk on. Mike, looking at you today, I think the floor is holding up just fine. I looked at my mom. She was wearing the gold lighthouse charm on a new necklace. She looked happy, truly happy. After the wedding, Claire and I moved into our first house. It wasn't the cottage, and it wasn't the big house I grew up in. It was a fixer-upper with drafty windows and a backyard that was mostly weeds. I spent the first weekend there in the garage. I'd moved his workbench from the storage unit, the real one, the one with the ledger. I set it up against the back wall. I opened the ledger to a blank page. August 14th, bought the house. Claire hates the wallpaper in the kitchen. I told her I'd strip it by Sunday. The roof looks okay, but the flashing around the chimney is loose. I'll fix it next weekend. I'm using the hammer you gave me. It still feels right in my hand. I closed the book and looked at the row of bins stacked neatly in the corner. 2030, 2035, 2040. They weren't shadows anymore. They were just boxes. I walked back into the house. Claire was in the kitchen, already tearing at a corner of the floral wallpaper. She looked at me and laughed, her face bright with the excitement of a new beginning. You ready to help? She asked. Yeah, I said, reaching for a scraper. I'm ready. I didn't need the letters to tell me what to do next. I just needed to be there. I needed to be the floor. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. In the center of the lawn, I'd already dug the hole. Next to it sat a small maple sapling, waiting to be planted. It would take 10 years to be big enough for a swing, but I had time. I had all the time in the world. The maple sapling took to the soil better than I expected. I spent that first autumn at the new house, following the ghost of his voice through the yard, winterizing the pipes and caulking the window frames. Every time I hit a snag, every time a pipe rattled in a way I didn't like, I'd head out to the garage and crack the ledger. But a funny thing started happening. I'd open the book to find his notes on plumbing or foundation rot, and I'd find myself reading them, nodding, and then closing the book before I even finished the entry. I was starting to know the answers before I read them. It wasn't magic. It was just that 8 months of watching him and a lifetime of being his son had finally sunk in. In the spring of the following year, Claire told me she was pregnant. The first person I wanted to tell was my dad. I actually walked halfway to the garage to get the ledger before I remembered that he couldn't answer back. I went to the cottage instead. My mother was in the garden. The maple tree he'd planted for her was starting to fill out, its leaves a vibrant, hopeful green. When I told her, she dropped her trowel and hugged me so hard I thought she'd break a rib. He knew, she whispered into my shoulder. He didn't know this, Mom. Not for sure. He knew, she insisted, pulling back with a teary smile. Go look at the unit, Mike. Go look at the box for this year. I drove to the storage facility. It was a Tuesday, the day he died, the day Dennis showed up, the day my life usually felt the heaviest. I rolled up the door to Unit 402. The smell of the place hit me like a physical presence. I went to the stack. I wasn't looking for a year this time. I was looking for a specific label he'd mentioned in the ledger months ago, one I'd ignored because I wasn't ready. I found it tucked behind the Times 2030 Times bin. It was a small wooden crate, handmade. On the top, in thick black marker, for the new arrival. My hands shook as I pried the lid off. Inside wasn't a letter. It was a cradle. He'd built it in pieces, flat-packed, sanded to a finish that felt like silk, with every screw and wooden dowel tucked into a labeled velvet bag. There was a blueprint on top, drawn with a ruler and a steady hand. I sat on the floor, surrounded by the smell of cedar and old dust, and I looked at the components of the bed my child would sleep in. He'd spent those last months, when his heart was struggling to move blood through his veins, carving the spindles for a grandchild he'd never even been told about. There was a small envelope taped to the headboard piece. Mike, it said, this is the last thing I built. I didn't finish the bookcase first. I finished this. I just kept the bookcase in the garage so you'd think that's what I was working on. A man needs a project, but a father needs a legacy. If it's a boy, tell him I was a better fisherman than I actually was. If it's a girl, tell her she's got her grandmother's eyes, and tell both of them that their father is a good man. I know, because I'm the one who raised him. I stayed in the unit until the sun went down. I didn't cry this time. I just felt a profound sense of peace. The secrecy, the lies, the normal year, it all made sense now. He wasn't trying to control us from the grave. He was trying to make sure that even when he was gone, he was still providing. He was still the floor. I brought the cradle home and assembled it in the room that would be the nursery. Every screw I turned felt like a handshake. Every joint that slid into place felt like a conversation. relaxation. The years started to move faster after that. My son was born in December. We named him Leo, my father's middle name. He slept in the cedar cradle, and when he grew too big for it, I didn't put it back in the storage unit. I polished it and put it in the attic, waiting for the next time it would be needed. By the time 2030 actually rolled around, I was 40. I had a mortgage, a second kid on the way, and a hairline that was starting to retreat just like his had. On the morning of his 10th anniversary, I went to the storage unit. I hadn't been there in over a year. The facility was under new management, and the gravel lot had been paved over with asphalt. Everything was cleaner, more modern, but Unit 402 still felt like a pocket of the past. I walked in and went straight to the bin, marked times 2030. I opened it. There was no scotch this time, no hidden deeds, just a single thin envelope. I opened it and read the final words he had for me. You're 40 now, or close to it. You've probably realized by now that I didn't have all the answers. I was just guessing most of the time. I was just a guy trying to keep the lights on and the rain out. If you're still reading these, do me a favor. Stop. You don't need my maps anymore. You've built your own house. You've raised your own kids. You've become the man I was trying to help you be. The letter ended with a list of names and phone numbers. They were old numbers, most of them probably disconnected by now. Dennis was at the top. Call Dennis, the note ended. He's getting old, and he misses our Tuesday night poker games. Go over there, bring a 6-pack of the cheap stuff, and let him tell you the stories about me that I was too embarrassed to put in writing. It's time you knew the real version of your old man, the one who messed up, the one who got scared, and the one who loved you more than he knew how to say. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. I looked around the unit. It was mostly empty now. The bins were gone. The tools were in my own garage, and the workbench was the only thing left. I didn't feel the need to keep the unit anymore. The library was finished. The lessons were learned. I called the office and gave my 30 days notice. Then, I drove over to Dennis's house. He was sitting on his porch, looking exactly like a man who had survived his best friend by a decade and wasn't sure what to do with the extra time. When he saw me pull up, he stood up, his joints popping audibly in the quiet afternoon. You finally finished the reading list, kid? He asked, a crooked grin spreading across his face. Yeah, Dennis, I said, holding up a paper bag with a cold 6-pack inside. I finished it, but I think there are a few chapters missing. Something about a poker game and a man who didn't know how to use a level. Dennis laughed, a deep, wheezing sound that echoed off the quiet street. He gestured to the chair next to him. Sit down, Mike. We've got a lot to talk about. We sat there until the stars came out. He told me about the time my dad almost got arrested in Tijuana. He told me about the night I was born and how my father had sat in the waiting room for 12 hours without moving, terrified and proud all at once. He told me the truth, the unfiltered, messy, beautiful truth of the man I'd spent 10 years trying to decode. I realized then that the letters were just the skeleton. This, the stories, the laughs, the shared memory, this was the soul. When I got home that night, the house was dark. Claire and Leo were asleep. I walked through the living room, past the bookcase my father had finished, and into the kitchen. I looked out the window at the maple tree in the backyard. It was huge now. Its branches reached out over the lawn, sturdy and wide. In the moonlight, I could see the silhouette of the wooden swing I'd hung from the strongest limb last summer. I wasn't waiting for a letter anymore. I wasn't looking for a sign. I just stood there in the quiet of my own home, in the life I had built on the floor he provided, and I felt great. I really did. The years that followed were quiet, the kind of quiet my father had worked so hard to buy for us. The storage unit was gone, the lease ended, and the physical weight of his instructions had finally distributed itself into the muscle memory of my daily life. I didn't need to look up how to shut off the water main or what to do when the pilot light flickered out. I just did it. Leo grew into a tall, lanky teenager with my father's jawline and a quiet streak that made me feel like I was living with a ghost. He didn't care much for sports, but he'd spend hours in the garage at that old mahogany workbench, sanding down scraps of wood just to see the grain come through. One Saturday, when Leo was 16, I found him staring at the ledger. I'd kept it on the shelf above the bench, a thick, battered book filled with 2 generations of handwriting. Did he really know? Leo asked, tracing the faded ink of the 2026 entries. Did he know I'd be here? He hoped, I said, leaning against the doorframe. He didn't have a crystal ball, Leo. He just knew that if he built a solid enough foundation, whoever stood on it would be okay. Leo looked at the empty space at the back of the book. There are a lot of blank pages left. Those are yours, I told him. That winter, my mother's health began to dip. It wasn't a sudden shock like the heart attack that took my dad. It was a slow, graceful fading, like a light being turned down bit by bit. She stayed in the cottage he'd bought for her, surrounded by the furniture he picked and the maple tree that now towered over the roof. I spent most nights there, sitting by her bed. We didn't talk about the bins or the letters anymore. We talked about the way the light hit the coast in September. We talked about the sound of my father's laugh. One evening, shortly before she passed, she reached out and took my hand. Her skin felt like parchment, thin, dry, and precious. He was a very stubborn man, Mike, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the window. I know, Mom, but he was right about the house, she said, a small, tired smile playing on her lips. I was happy here. I never told him, but I was. He knew, I said, and for the first time, I was absolutely sure of it. After she was gone, I had to go through the cottage. It was a different experience than moving her out of the big house. There was no clutter here. Every object had a place. Every drawer was organized. It was a house that had been lived in by someone who knew their time was finite and didn't want to leave a mess. In the back of her closet, tucked behind her winter coats, I found a small metal lockbox. There was no key, but I didn't need one. I knew the trick to the latch. It was the same one my father had used on his tackle box. A sharp tap on the left side, and it popped open. Inside was a single envelope, yellowed with age. It wasn't from my father. It was from her. To whoever has to clean this out, it read. Probably Mike. If it's Leo, tell your father to go get a glass of water and sit down. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Your father thought he was the only one playing the long game, she wrote. He thought he was the only one who knew how to plan for a future he wouldn't see. But I knew him. I knew he'd leave you those letters. I knew he'd build that cradle. And I knew that eventually you'd stop looking at his words and start looking at your own life. Attached to the letter was a small, rusted key to a safe deposit box at the local bank. There's no money money in there," the note continued, "and there are no instructions, just the things I saved that he forgot to. The photos of him when he was young and didn't think anyone was watching. The letters he wrote me when we were 20 and he didn't know how to spell forever, but he meant it anyway. He gave you the floor, Mike. I'm giving you the heart." I went to the bank the next day. The box was small. Inside were the fragments of a man I hadn't seen in the ledger. There was a photo of him covered in mud, laughing as he tried to fix a broken tractor. There was a receipt for the first dinner they ever had, with a note on the back saying she was the most beautiful girl in the county. There was a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. I realized then that my father had given me the map to survive, but my mother had kept the reason why we bother surviving at all. I took the box home and put it on the workbench. That night, I sat out on the back porch. The maple tree was losing its leaves, the red and gold carpet covering the lawn. I could hear Leo in the garage, the steady times, scritch times of a hand plane moving over wood. I thought about the cycle of it all, the secrets kept out of love, the plans made in the dark, the heavy responsibility of being the one who stays behind to keep the lights on. I wasn't the son anymore. I was the patriarch. I was the one who would eventually have to write the letters and seal the bins. I was the one who would have to decide what to tell and what to hide to give my children their own normal year. I got up and walked into the garage. Leo looked up, wiping sawdust from his forehead. "Hey, Dad," he said. "I'm almost finished with the jewelry box for Mom's birthday." "Looks good, Leo. Real good." I walked over to the workbench and picked up the ledger. I flipped to the very last page, the one Leo had pointed out. I picked up a pen and started to write. I didn't write about the water heater. I didn't write about the taxes or the fuse box. I wrote about the way the light looked on the lake when the bass weren't biting. I wrote about the smell of the strawberries we bought on the side of the road. I wrote about the sound of his mother's laugh in the kitchen of a cottage that was just the right size. I wrote the things that don't help you fix a house, but help you stay in one. When I finished, I closed the book and handed it to my son. "Keep this," I said, "and when you're ready, add your own pages." Leo took the book, his hands steady and strong. "Is there a trick to it?" he asked. Being a father, I thought about the white envelope, the storage unit, and the empty chair at the wedding. I thought about the floor and the heart. "Yeah," I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. "The trick is to make them think it's easy, even when it's the hardest thing you've ever done." I walked out of the garage and into the house. The lights were on, the rain was stayed, and the foundation was holding. It was just a regular night, and in this family, that was the greatest legacy of all. Leo moved the ledger to his own room that night. I didn't see it again for 3 years. He went off to State College to study structural engineering, a choice that felt so on the nose. I almost laughed when he showed me the acceptance letter. While he was gone, the house felt cavernous. Claire and I reclaimed the space, turning his old bedroom into a hobby room, but we left the garage exactly as it was. The workbench stayed. The scent of cedar stayed. When Leo graduated, he didn't come home to look for a corporate firm in the city. He came home and told me he wanted to buy the storage facility. "The one where Grandpa had the unit?" I asked. We were sitting on the back porch, the maple tree now thick enough to shade half the yard. "It's for sale, Dad. The guy who bought it years ago let it go to seed. The fences are rusted, the units leak, but the bones are good. It's a solid foundation." He said it without irony. He didn't even realize he was using the language of the men who came before him. I went in on the loan with him. We spent the summer of 2029 out in that gravel lot, the same way my dad and Dennis probably spent their summers 40 years ago, sweating, swearing, and fixing things that other people had let rot. We replaced the rolling doors on all 400 units. We paved the lot. We installed a security system that actually worked. On the day we finished, Leo walked me down the 4th row. He stopped in front of a door that had been freshly painted a dark forest green. He handed me a key. 402, I said, looking at the number. "I kept it out of the rental pool," Leo said. "I figured we might need the space." We walked inside. It was empty, scrubbed clean, the concrete floor still damp from a power wash. Leo had built a new workbench against the back wall, but he'd salvaged the vise from my father's old bench. It was bolted down tight, ready for work. "I found something," Leo said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in a rag. He unwrapped it. It was a brass plumb bob, the tool you use to find a perfectly vertical line. It was old, the brass tarnished to a deep tea color, but the point was still sharp enough to draw blood. "It was behind the wall in the cottage when I helped the new owners move their stuff in last month," Leo said. "It has initials on the top." I took it. Engraved in the brass, nearly worn away by decades of use, were the letters L.T. Lawrence Thorne, my father's father. My dad hadn't just built that floor for me. He had been standing on a floor built by a man he never talked about, using tools that had seen the Great Depression and 2 world wars. The chain wasn't just 2 links long. It went back into the dark, a long line of men holding onto a string, trying to make sure the next generation didn't lean too far to one side. I stood there in the center of Unit 402, holding the weight of my grandfather in the palm of my hand, looking at my son. "He never mentioned this," I said. "Maybe he didn't need to," Leo replied. "Maybe the tool is the message." That evening, I went home and found Claire in the kitchen. She was looking through a box of old photos, the ones my mother had kept in the safe deposit box. She held up one I hadn't looked at in a while. It was my father, maybe 25 years old, standing in the frame of a house under construction. He was holding a hammer, looking tired, but he was grinning at the camera like he'd just won the lottery. "He looks like Leo," Claire said. "He looks like a man who knows what he's building," I corrected. I took the photo and went out to the garage. I opened the ledger. I had stopped writing in it for a while, letting Leo take the lead, but tonight I felt the itch. August 12, 2029. Leo opened the facility today. We kept 402. I found a plumb bob that belonged to your father. I realized today that you weren't just protecting us from the end. You were protecting the beginning. You were making sure the line stayed straight so Leo could build something bigger than a bookcase or a cradle. He's building a business. He's building a life. And he's doing it with your vice. I paused, the pen hovering over the paper. I finally get it. The normal year wasn't a lie. It was a practice run. You were teaching us how to live without you while you were still here to catch us if we tripped. Well, we're not tripping anymore. We're walking just fine. I closed the book and tucked the photo of my young, grinning father between the pages. The next morning, I woke up early. The house was quiet, the air smelling of the coffee Claire had already already started. I walked out to the backyard. The maple tree was at the height of its power, its branches heavy with the fullness of summer. I sat on the swing, the one I'd hung for Leo years ago, the one that had held my daughter after him, and the one that would eventually hold someone else. I pushed off the ground, my feet finding the familiar rhythm. I looked at the house. The roof was tight. The gutters were clean. The foundation was settled and strong. I didn't have a letter to read. I didn't have a bin to open. I just had the morning, the swing, and the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew his father would be proud of the view. The line was straight. The floor was solid. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was following a map. I felt like I was the one drawing it.